Thank you very much. Pleased to have this opportunity and found all this very insightful. And in terms of critiquing Stephen's lecture, I actually don't have a lot to critique. I quite enjoyed it, found it quite insightful. I am going to take issue with two things that I learned from yesterday that I would just like to discuss a little bit. And finally, I would like to go back to Stephen and ask him to take out his crystal ball one more time and perhaps give us a little bit more insights on one more issue, which I'll get to. So first off, the two issues that I want to talk about from yesterday, just again very briefly. The first was a lecture which I found quite interesting that pointed out that a big part of the growth in demand for oil is actually coming from the Middle East. I saw something like a 7% increase in growth. And the second fact that we were shown was that this, what I'll call break-even price of oil. The break-even price of oil was defined on this slide as the price of oil that we would need in a place like Saudi Arabia to pay for all the services that come out of their oil revenues, and those break-even prices are quite high. I'd like to argue that at least in the short run, these two facts are actually very positive for supply, and at least in the short run, they're going to put a damper on price increases, which I don't think was the consensus in the discussion. In the short run, if the cost is $125 a barrel, in terms of I need $125 a barrel to be able to provide the social services for the people, that's not going to imply that that's going to increase the price of oil to $125 a barrel in the same way as if it was a cost of actually developing and pulling out the oil. In fact, it's sort of the opposite. In countries where you've got a lot of money earmarked for your oil revenues, a lot of services that I've been promising, that's generally going to provide an incentive for them to increase supply. So I would expect to see a lot more drilling in Saudi Arabia. The idea that they're going to be the ones that cut back on supply when prices drop. They may not be as reliable in terms of doing that. They may in fact have an incentive to increase production during price drops because they need to come up with the revenue to meet their obligations. So you actually get situations where you get what's known as a backward bending supply curve, where production increases when price goes down. And that would be something that I would be concerned about if I was in the oil business and saw such a high percentage of the increase in demand coming from places like Saudi Arabia. And again, Saudi Arabia can only continue to increase their demand if in fact prices go up, because the increase in demand for oil in Saudi Arabia comes from the higher price. So these are factors that are going to, in some sense, put a damper on the price rise in the immediate future. The second issue that I want to just briefly mention is this concept of energy return on investment. That's obviously a concept that is important. I think if you view that concept in isolation and ignore other parts of the economics, I think it can be misleading though. What we're seeing today is a pretty big disconnect between prices of liquids, like oil and other natural gas liquids, and other sources of energy. And so what we're seeing in this environment is there's a huge incentive to take any form of energy I have and turn it into something that's liquid. Okay, so that could be natural gas going into fertilizer and then going into production of corn to produce ethanol. You could go directly to natural gas to liquids. There's all sorts of different ways we can use natural gas and coal that eventually ends up in liquids. I've seen people growing algae using fluorescent lights. And obviously, that's not going to produce any new energy, but it's going to take energy from a source that's not a liquid and turn it into a liquid. And that's how that economics works. So the EROI, the energy return on investment, is a useful concept, but it sort of goes out the window when there's a huge disconnect between the prices of different types of energy. Now, finally, I do want to talk a little bit more about the disconnect between the price of oil and the price of gas. The price ratio now between a barrel of oil and an MMBTU of gas is somewhere on the range of 25 to 30 to 1. In terms of heat content, it should be more like 6 or 7 to 1. So there's a huge disconnect between the price of oil and the price of gas. It's about 4 times as expensive oil is relative to gas than we might expect it to be on a heat rate. It's currently 25 to 30 to 1. I think eventually it has to go back to the 10 to 15 to 1 ratio. Now this is for Stephen in terms of his crystal ball. How fast is that convergence going to occur? How quickly will we have the ratio of natural gas to oil change from it's 30 to 1 to its more historic 10 to 15 to 1? And how is that going to happen? Is that going to happen with natural gas prices going up, or will it happen with oil prices going down? If I did have a crystal ball that could tell me the speed of convergence and also the mechanism of convergence, there's a lot of bets that I would make that could make a lot of money. So again, that's why that crystal ball is very useful. Stephen talked about CNG vehicles. People are also developing LNG vehicles. The electric car is going to take natural gas to generate electricity to drive a car. The chemical business is booming in the US because of the cheap natural gas relative to oil. There's chemicals that are made with natural gas in the US that are made with oil in other parts of the world. Anyone that's producing chemicals with oil rather than natural gas is no longer competitive, and that's why our business here is booming. So there's just lots of different channels by which we're going to see that convergence. I don't know which of those channels are going to happen. I don't know how fast it's going to happen. So maybe I'll again ask Stephen when we have Q&A, what does he see as the mechanism and how fast it's going to occur. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Titman. Jim Hansen, I know you're familiar with Stephen's work, but just tell us how you incorporate into your advice for your clients, and I don't know the kind of questions you keep asking, and how you respond to this kind of scenario that Stephen described, and history as well.
I guess the biggest point is that we've got a floor price where the marginal barrel is going to get produced. Now, there's 2 components to that. It's what's it going to cost to produce shale tight oil up in North Dakota. Maybe it's $50 cost. You look at some of the public companies who are saying their CapEx is curtailed at anything under 85. So I've got a price floor there of that tight oil, maybe $85. But then what else controls price? And I would contend that the Saudis and the Russians are major players in that price. If the Russians need north of $100, the Saudis need something approaching $100. They're the swing producers. Russians obviously can swing than the Saudis. But if they need $100, they don't have to pull too much off their exports to bring that $100 price. So that gives us kind of a floor. The other key number, and I think is really critical because most people completely miss this, and that's Stephen's upper limit number. There's a number up there around that $125 to $135 range where he's talking about the developing countries, the big takers of supply, start to hit their heads on the ceiling. The entire airline industry globally goes operating profit negative in the $120 plus range. And that is critical because that gap continues to narrow. So when I'm looking at corporations, I look and see if you can't fit your business model through that kind of a perspective, long term, I can't go with you. So that's kind of where we would start from, and that gives you a little insights to how I would use, I think, some of the most important numbers that you brought there.
Okay, thank you very much, Jim. And just note that we found out over these 2 days that if we have fewer microphones, we do better. So that, you're Sharon, you're over here, and you guys are microphone buddies over there. But I'd like to ask Robert Rapier, one, you're a technology guy and an engineer, and part of your job is Valley Technologies, but I guess I'm wondering how some of the economic context that Stephen described would sort of affect some of the way you look at things, as well as I think you had a different idea about the ceiling for oil prices. So please comment on that.
Yeah, I think something he said that I absolutely agree with is there is no real replacement for oil. We don't have anything like it. And so the developing countries, for instance, I mean, the slide that I showed earlier, as oil prices went up, they crossed $100. There wasn't really, I looked at Asia Pacific, but there was really no demand decrease, maybe very slight inflection. And so I say I said my thesis earlier, a few years ago, was developing countries would be priced out of the market as prices go up. And I revised that over time because I realized, no, the countries that have excess consumption, those are the ones you're going to cut because they can cut and it doesn't hurt. But the developing countries, they continue to consume. Every developing region in the world had double-digit demand growth over the last decade. And the developed countries, EU and the US, they fell. And that makes sense now to think about that. Over time, I mean, if you've got somebody who's only using a barrel a year, but you've got 3 billion of those people, I don't know that $200 a barrel is going to keep them from, I mean, they pile 7 people on a moped to go across town. I've seen them. Ultimately, they're going to set the price. I mean, they're going to be the ones that set the price. In the U.S., people say, our oil production is up and our demand is down. Why are we still paying this price for oil? Because that's what the Chinese are willing to pay and the Indians are willing to pay. That's why. So I think price can go higher. I mean, it may strangle us slowly. I mean, this is why I talked about the threat of OPEC. OPEC, if they hold firm, and I think they've learned their lessons in the past, they can strangle us slowly.
Okay, I guess I'd like Stephen to maybe, I don't know if he has any responses to any of that, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
Yeah, am I out here? So as regards CNG, in the U.S., some of the factors in CNG is historically legislation and regulation for CNG were written before the whole oil shock period. So they were written pre-2005. And consequently, the regulations are not intended to be cost effective. They just threw them out there. Well, what if you had a CNG car? Okay, let's throw some regs for EPA and DOT and whatever. And what seems to me is that makes a very expensive CNG tank, which is $3,000 and north. And if you do that, your break even for gas versus oil is about 3 years. So if the difference is $2 a gallon and you're consuming 500 gallons and you have about $3,000 to play with, you do the math. So that's the biggest differential you could have between a gasoline powered and a natural gas powered car in terms of price to get a break even from the consumer. Okay, so if you don't have that, so if you have a natural gas tank that costs $3,000 or more, then you're going to sell small volumes, and then the auto manufacturers pile on the overhead, and that's how you get these $10,000 differentials, which we've had between gasoline powered and CNG cars. ARPA is working right now to develop technologies that hopefully improve this situation. The proposals went out, I would say maybe 8 months ago, and so they went out to various companies to do R&D. We'll see how that develops. So I think it's one thing. Another thing which is really critically important is the notion that we continue to be in an oil shock. I mean, that's just a very, very important notion. I had a chance to sit in on a presentation by Maria van der Hoeven, who was the executive director of the IEA. She was in New York a few days ago, and I said, well, do you believe that OECD oil consumption is in secular decline? And she was very uncomfortable with that question, right? So until you convince yourself, or someone is convinced, that it's highly likely that the OECD economies will continue to be, thank God it's not my phone, okay, that oil consumption will continue to decline and will not recover ever in the OECD, then you don't really have a problem. okay? And you can go to places, API, if you ask the American Petroleum Institute why oil demand is falling, they'll say it's a lack of aggregate demand. They think it's a demand side issue, not a supply side issue. It's very important. So first you have to establish that, and then secondly you have to establish that there's a link between oil consumption and GDP. And the economics community has skirted this issue meticulously. And the reason they've skirted this issue is because as soon as you're talking oil and GDP, then you are implicitly accepting that you are trading off your climate programs against your economy. Okay? And economists don't want to do that, most of them. Okay? It's a very painful place to go if you'd like to be nice to everybody and, you know, hug your polar bear, but you'd also like to see the guy get a job. So there needs to be a realization, and that realization has been assiduously avoided by the economics community for some time. We'll see whether it happens. If we cycle into recession, I think that issue is up. So you need a technology development, and you need to have a change mindset. Once you have those two, then you can start talking about fuel switching. Forgive me for a very long-winded answer to a relatively short question. Then you have what you need for fuel switching, because if you're going to bring in CNG, you need a lot of infrastructure, and there are a lot of network issues associated with that. You know, you can't just bring in, you need filling stations and all standards and all that sort of stuff. So I think those two are prerequisites. After that, the numbers say you get very rapid adoption. I have to tell you, if I could fill my car for $35 instead of $70, you know, I would drive the 4 miles to Walmart to fill it up. And so would a lot of Americans. So the preconditions for acceptance are there, the value proposition is there. But the institutional prerequisites aren't aligned with that. So I'll leave it at that for the moment.
I think there's a lot to respond to there. And so for our audience, okay, we've had a lot of opportunities to hold forth. So I'd like to keep this relatively rapid fire. Okay, our microphone holders will continue to hold the microphone. Please don't take it from them. Comment or question, but let's keep it concise. Let's keep it moving. Let's start with Michael Kumhoff over here, please. And that's about it. Just keep it. Let's keep it going. You can, a question, comment, any of the panel, and the panel can jump in as needed. Please, Michael.
Yeah. So I have a question for Mr. Kopits that has to do with the carrying capacity. We had a discussion yesterday about substitutability, elasticity to substitution, how high can prices go and how fast, et cetera, et cetera. And so I would like you to expand a little bit on how you compute this carrying capacity, what variables enter into that, so that I can get a better sense of how I could basically incorporate it into my own work.
It's really simple. You take oil consumption as a share of GDP, and then you look at the price where it starts to fall. And then you use the share of consumption in GDP as your breakpoint. So in the US, when oil consumption, we have four periods now where oil consumption has exceeded 4.5% of GDP. Okay, and if you look at that, in each time the US will start to shed consumption, and it'll keep shedding until it gets back to below 4. Like 2.5 is where the economy would like to be. It doesn't go below that. But so it's just a share of GDP, and that'll give you a pretty good, it's a pretty reliable indicator, and these things have turned where we've accepted. So you just take a look at oil consumption as a share of GDP. You take your ruler across that point as a share of GDP where you see oil consumption start to decline, and that's your carrying capacity. You work it backwards.
Panel, anything to add? Hold on to the microphone. Please, I'm sorry, Kevin was next, and then Tad, and then Hans on this side. We might go back and forth. Aaron, go ahead, Kevin, please.
Okay, so very briefly, how did you was your calculation on China at 120, was that simply by the same analysis there? Were you just observing when it appears to fall? Or?
Yeah, China's a lot harder because if you take a look at the statistics, there's a lot more variability in it. So in the US, it's like 4.5% of GDP. In China, it's like 6.2, 6.3% of GDP. That's kind of the break point. But if you look at the historical data, it's quite variable. So it's somewhere between 6.2 and 6.7% of GDP. And remember, with China, the percent of GDP, the carrying capacity declines over time. That's what we mean by declining marginal utility. But
Okay,
everybody-
so there's some reasons to think it might be a lot higher. And the most interesting argument I've heard on that is Europe, where you look at Europe and Japan, where they artificially raise the price with taxes, and so you get to much higher price points than the United States, and they've just stayed there for a very long time. And so then the question is, are these declines we've seen in the U.S. temporary, where you just lopped off some particularly egregious consumer of energy, subprime, and then after you get rid of absorbing that, then you go on to some much higher price point?
Yeah, so with regards to Europe, what happens is if you raise the taxes, right, you'll decrease your consumption threshold, right? You'll get smaller cars and live in smaller apartments and be close together. So your inherent level will be lower. But if you go up from that level, you have the same kind of stresses going from there pro rata. Okay, I don't know if that was clear enough.
Let's keep that on. Aaron?
That was short.
Oh,
I just saw a couple people on the panel taking notes earlier, and I felt like they were taking notes to respond to each other. And I'm curious if anybody did have any responses on their notepads right now, and if they might be willing to share those.
I'll give you one. That people talk about the price. I know I can't give you specific investment advice, but I can give you some thoughts. We don't look too much at the price, the quoted price of oil when we're making our analysis. We look at the refinery acquisition price, which is what the refineries are actually paying in the United States, and that's currently north of $100. And that is really important because that's reflected on the seaborne pricing. So that these really great prices we hear about coming in North Dakota, they're not the prices that are set in the refinery prices. And as that shifts and that changes, that'll become important. But right now, if you're a refinery operating in the United States, you're paying between $100 and $105 a barrel for oil. So.
I just wanted to add. Okay, just to add one thing. Part of the reason why economists find it very difficult with this concept of carrying capacity, and I think the gentleman on the right that asked questions was sort of getting at that. There's a big difference between sort of the short run and the long run. And in the short run, if oil prices in a country like the United States, if prices go from $50 a barrel to $150 a barrel in a 6-month period, that's going to put a tremendous strain on the economy because people can't adjust. But at the same time, people in Europe are driving their cars and adjusting well with $8 a barrel or $8 a gallon of gasoline because they've basically adjusted to that level over a number of years. So when you talk about the carrying capacity, there's a short run effect, which is oil prices spike up. It's going to have a big effect. And in the long run, there's an adjustment.
Robert?
Yeah, I want to respond to the Europe example. Europeans pay the equivalent of $300 to $400 a barrel because of the taxes and so forth, and yet they still consume 10 barrels per person. That's quite high relative to the rest of the world. Global average, 4.7 barrels per person if you gave everybody in the world an equal allotment of oil. We're one of the highest at 22, Europe's at 10, China's at 2, India's 1 or less than 1. I see them continuing to raise their consumption. I mean, you look at Europe and you say even at $400, they are still consuming twice the global allotment. So all these developing countries are going to want to continue to move higher. And I don't know that if Europe is willing to pay $300 or $400 and still consume what they consume, I think the expectations are that all those developing regions will continue to pay more and more and more and consume more.
Tad?
I want to ask two brief questions. Well, one brief comment. Professor Lake and I concocted plots in which we plotted GDP per person versus barrels equivalent per year, and using the CIA data, and all 200 countries on the planet follow the same power law. Which then my question is, and we need to check that perhaps the threshold value for each economy is about 4% of their GDP, regardless of the country and the economy. So I don't know, I need to look at this, but that's a very interesting observation that all countries follow identically the same trend, and that trend follows the mammalian metabolism with body weight. So oil is like blood, okay, so there you are. So that's a comment and food for thought. The question I'm asking now is, as a chairman of petroleum engineering, do you see the US petroleum industry now going into a cycle where they're gonna decrease their investment and decrease their employment? Because that could be kind of interesting for me in terms of my admissions.
There's already, in the shale gas part, there's a significant pullback in investment. Shale oil is treading water now. One of the important things to keep in mind in the shale oil is that a lot of shale oil is not just oil. It's in the Bakken, for example, it's about equal thirds shale, oil, gas, and NGLs. And so the economics of drilling there are affected not only by oil prices, but by NGL and gas prices as well. And the rig count, the U.S. onshore rig count has stalled out since June of this past year. So there's something going on there. I mean, Art may know more about this than I do, but I don't expect employment to go down. So it's possible we'll have some sort of cyclical thing, but right now, I mean, in Houston, by golly, if you have some engineering skills, they are starved out for it. At present, I'm not sure that there's going to be any sort of longer-term kind of structural downturn.
Okay, I have a question for the panel while I'm looking for someone over here. Raise your hand if you have a question on this side of the room, but this is something prompted by Robert, but I'd like to have any of the panel think about that. As far as, I mean, when I think I last talked to you, Robert, or when we first talked about you coming here, you were somewhere in Eastern Europe, somewhere on that side of the ocean. But what I wonder is, when you're looking for investment opportunities and companies that might either somehow react well or benefit from all this, does it matter where you're doing business when you're talking about investment in energy technologies? I mean, I think you're looking at OECD countries and less developed countries. So I'm just wondering how, as an investor, where this happens seems to matter.
Yeah,
so.
Absolutely. I mean, regulations and taxes and all those things matter. I mean,
but how about related to what Stephen's talking about in terms of the relative competitiveness, or how this might just affect their business environment, not necessarily their policy environment?
Yeah, I mean, and other thing that's important is, for example, in Japan, they're paying $17 a million BTUs, a lot higher than we are for natural gas. So if you could go into Japan and say have a cheap supply of wood and make synthetic natural gas, you could do that a lot more effectively than you could here in the U.S., where we're competing with cheap natural gas. So there are projects that can be done in a lot of places that can't be done in the U.S. for that reason. You're just competing with very cheap natural gas. But where I live, Hawaii is a very, very difficult place to do business because everybody is against everything. It's very hard. I mean, I've said before, I've just watched things develop out there. If you were giving away money, there would be protesters. I mean, there would be protesters for everything. But yeah, I mean, the local, we got forestry down in Malaysia, and it's pretty cheap wood. It's plantation forest, not virgin forest. We actually like tree farming. We think tree farming over time, if you're not cutting down rainforest, much more sustainable in the long term than farming maybe. Like if I wanted to make fuel, or say I want to make electricity, we like the concept of being able to take trees, plant them, get them established, let them grow for 7 to 10 years, and you don't have to go out there and till up the ground every year, and you're not losing topsoil and so forth. And then you can harvest those trees, convert them into electricity or something else. It's very hard to convert them into liquid fuel. There's really not a good way to do that economically, but you can actually turn them into electricity economically in certain places. So we like that concept. The problem is very little biomass is grown sustainably. I mean, when we're turning biomass into fuels, it's usually not done sustainably. So, we try. We're not driven entirely by profit. We're almost a pseudo nonprofit. We do a lot of things just because the guy I work for is very concerned about peak oil, and so he invests that way a lot. So, we got to have some solutions.
Okay. Does the panel, Jim or Sheridan, have any thoughts on the location? I mean, where are your students, going to after graduation, and where are those companies doing business, et cetera? Just as it relates to our discussion here.
Well, I actually think Texas has a big comparative advantage right now. Our business climate is better than Hawaii. Companies are moving from California to Texas for the same reason. And Houston is doing well. And again, there's just a lot of industries that are going to benefit from cheap natural gas, such as the chemical industry, some of the manufacturing, refining. So all in all, sort of locating near cheap natural gas and a business-friendly climate is probably a good idea.
I guess I'd ask the question, what is the price of gas going to be? I mean, you say cheap natural gas, because this is a big theme in our investment portfolio. And so, is it $4, $5, $8, $2? What do you think?
Over what time period?
Oh, say the 5 years. 5 years, 5 or 6 years on.
Yeah, I wanted to push Stephen on that more, but my own view, so
The
you
answer
were
was
saying
7.
what?
Let the record show the answer was
7 to 8 is what you're saying, Stephen? Yeah, that sounds about right for 5 or 6 years. People I talk to say that as soon as natural gas prices go to $5, there's just a ton of supply that's going to come back on the market. So we've pretty much stopped drilling in the Burnett Shale and any place where you have dry gas. Which is, you drill, all you get is natural gas and no liquids. That's all been stopped. And that stuff becomes pretty economic around $5. And then it's restarted about that price.
Okay, Hans.
The
Jim.
reason I ask that is because when you look at the statements by the public companies, you don't get that number. You get costs of $6, just costs, break-even costs. And they're in their public presentations. Then when you put a profit on there, you got to be up $8. And a lot of this gas, at $8, a lot of the models, all of a sudden coal's back on the table dramatically as a power generating source. And in fact, there's some switching already going on. We're seeing it in coal tonnage already. So the industry folks who say you're going to see a lot of new drilling coming on, there are undeveloped wells out there, that need to be hooked up. And that's a really hard number to get because the companies aren't forthcoming with that. But I think that the number, and I agree with Stephen, we're up in that $7 and $8 range. The dynamics are quite a bit different than at $4. And so I would be careful in that price number because there's a 100% difference there.
So 5 years, you'd say it could be above 8?
I think we'll be there before that.
Above 8 before that?
We'll be up pushing. We could, if you just look, we went negative storage here, and I don't want to get into price predictions because I don't do that. I have prime directives, by the way, is never predict price because you will be wrong. Okay.
So
but from a planning perspective, as an investor, I'm looking long range, and my time frame with our firm is 5 years, and so I'm looking out 5 years. So the gas price. But the reason I asked that was I wanted to get a sense of where you're at, and I think maybe you're a little low, but you're not. I've had people tell me $2 in the natural gas business.
No, all the dry gas is being shut down right now, and so the reason why we've got a glut of gas is there's still a lot of wet gas, and the price of liquids are high. So,
Ethane's a 10-year low.
what's that?
Ethane just hit a 10-year low.
Right.
That's not a high for a liquid. Are
Okay,
you talking about oil or NGLs?
Well, there's NGLs.
Okay, well, ethane, those prices
Okay, yeah, those are,
they're in
but
the
they're high
toilet.
relative to the natural gas. The
Okay.
wet stuff is high relative to the dry stuff, and it keeps those things economic.
Okay, I understand.
And so if you have only dry, that's all shut down. And the people I've talked to, maybe, who knows, but they're saying around 5, they can restart that stuff, 5 or 6. And you've got a lot of coal plants that are shut down that aren't operating now because natural gas is so cheap. So natural gas goes up 5 or 6, and the coal comes back. So there's a lot of economic factors that keep natural gas from going up to 7 and 8.
Yeah, but you need to be a little careful between marginal cost and full cycle cost, right? Because marginal cost is right in 2 or 3 years to bring it back out, but at some point the full cycle cost will start weighing on this industry. So you need to be cognizant that there's that $5.50 that takes you back to marginal cost. The guys already have land, you know, but the full cycles I think is going to be higher than that.
So in the spirit, we said we would sort of not necessarily go in, well, we wanted to keep it flowing on this topic. So I'd like to keep on this. I think Art Berman, who thinks about gas every once in a while, has something to say about this. And then I'd like to go to Doug Hansen. And then if you don't mind, I'll come back to Hans and Carrie, and just raise your hand as well.
7's the right number, and I think we'll be there in a lot less than 5 years. I don't think that people are going to rush back to drilling dry gas when prices get to $5. The reason is it's not commercial at $5. The only people that will go back to drilling at $5 are those that don't have better opportunities and still have a company, and they may not by then. But the critical issue for E&P companies is they've got to grow reserves and they've got to grow production because they don't have any cash, and they don't have any earnings, and they don't have any reason to exist. But somebody wants to put money in them, so they'll take it. I think the coal issue, the coal plants that are being retired are the ones that can't meet EPA standards. There's an awful lot of very efficient modern coal plants. Those are the ones that start switching back at 325, like Jim said. I can show you a graph of the price points. All the switching, I mean, switching began at $4.50 or $5, but the bulk of the switching began when it got below $4. So, and when you got below 3, my goodness, I mean, the world changed. So I think that all the people that we talk to are all wrong about this. And if you go back and look at what happened after the price collapse after 2001, it's astonishing how fast the price of gas came back. So it's a timing issue, and I think maybe what you were saying about how bureaucrats don't want to put themselves on the line is a big piece of it. Thank you.
Doug.
So I'm bothered by something I was hearing from Steve, and I guess what I would throw out, it reminds me of Tad's wonderful sense of humor. We have a situation where we have globally, certainly as the U.S., 1 foot in a bucket of ice water, 1 foot in a bucket of boiling water, and on average, we're comfortable. The tug of war I'm seeing is between the climate world and the energy world, which I was referencing earlier. So I'm kind of going to reference this to you, Steve. You know, I was with James Hansen, Dr. James Hansen, one of the most formidable, respected climate scientists in the world last year in D.C. He's worried sick that 350 is the limit on where we can have a livable planet. This isn't just like an optional deal. This is called a livable planet. And right now we're at 395 parts CO2 per million and rising. And the lady today had a totally depressing thing from UC Davis that in her best case scenario with climate modification, we go to 530. So it just sounds like there's this either or thing. There's people I know like Lester Brown that say, we had better do a World War II right now, stop using fossil fuels and put up millions of wind turbines, which we know isn't going to happen. That's because if you want a solution, that's your solution. And you're suggesting, rightfully so, that we want it all. We want growth, we need jobs, and if we decline our use of energy, as you said, 1.5% a year, bingo, there's a direct correlation to GDP, so it goes down. And so just reflect for me, where are we at with that nexus between climate, tug of war, and the growth of energy so that we can grow? How do we do that?
I don't know if you know, Jim Hansen's office is on top of Tom's Diner. Dun, 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 dun. So Hansen's office is on top of Tom's Diner in New York. So since my office is also in New York, I don't really trust him either. But you know, the jobs issue is here now. The climate issue is somewhere in the future. I think a fair question is, when people start leaving Texas for Buffalo, then you know you have a problem. Because Texas in the summer is ungodly. I mean, in Houston, Satan himself goes to Cape Cod. But the truth is, there are a lot of people in Houston in the summer. You know, it's really hot, so it continues to go on. So you have to make some decision there. I think energy policy for me is in 3 phases. The first one is, if you lack a commodity, go out and get more of it. So if you don't have enough oil, get more of it. That's step one. Step two is you substitute to the nearest substitute, which is natural gas. Okay, that's medium term. The third level that you can do if you want is to going to electric vehicles. And you can make those work if you go to self-driving electric vehicles. You can make the economics work. So there's, for me, if I were doing policy, number one is get more oil, number two is get the natural gas queued up, and number three is get self-driving technology, permitted and out there. And then you can have electric cars actually in a more diversified fleet that looks more like the power fleet rather than our just monopolistic oil transportation fleet.
Professor Sheridan, I'm wondering if just where climate, this can be about specifically what we've been talking about, but even just in the business school and your students and energy management innovation, what's going on in that? How do you guys think about it? Is it an opportunity? Is it, especially here in Texas?
How we think about climate, or?
Yeah, like climate business. I mean, there's a lot of business schools that are trying to talk about sustainability. Is that happening in Texas, or you guys just?
No, we think a lot about it. Again, in the business school, we don't know anything about climate science, but we do talk to people in other parts of the university. And my impression, just talking to other people, and again, I'm not the expert, is that this is a real concern. And from our perspective, in the business school, at least my own perspective, I guess I shouldn't talk for the whole business school, but it seems to me that we've got to have some sort of tax on carbon, a gasoline tax, a tax on coal-fired power plants, or however we want to do it. That's got to be done. And this idea that that's bad for the economy, well, I think the Hurricane Sandy was very bad for the economy as well. And so doing nothing isn't particularly good for the economy. In terms of jobs, if you had a large tax on carbon and you use that money for infrastructure, I think that'd be very good for the economy, good for jobs.
Yeah, Robert, I know you think about climate a bit, so.
I do. I mean, solutions that can't be practically implemented are not solutions at all. I think the carbon tax can be done. I think it can be done in a revenue neutral manner that politicians could get people behind. But a lot of the solutions I hear are cannot practically be implemented. The fact is, the historical emissions, the inventory up there now belongs to the United States largely. Going forward, we are going to have very little impact on what's up there. We could cease to exist tomorrow, and we would only be back, if the US and the EU ceased to exist tomorrow, ceased emissions completely, or we went totally carbon neutral, we'd only be back to like mid-90s levels of emissions, and they would be climbing rapidly. So any sort of solution has to factor in, I mean, the developing regions are the key to any sort of solution. And again, the analogy here is an obese person trying to tell a thin person they need to go on a diet. I mean, we're not in a moral position to do this. And so I don't see a real solution. I mean, we can do a lot in the United States. We can bring our economy to its knees. It's not going to make any difference. We're not going to impact. There's not going to be an inflection point on that curve that I showed of CO2. Of all the things that have been done, of Kyoto, of all the price going up and down, that curve is accelerating. So nothing has impacted upon that at all. So if it is a problem, if 350 is an unlivable number, you better just hope that he's wrong, because it's going to keep going. I mean, it's going to keep going. I mean, it's not coming down anytime soon. And so again, I'm back to hope, because I don't have any idea how to solve that problem. China is locking in decades of emissions right now with all these coal plants that they're building.
Oz?
This question goes to both relevancy and irony. The relevancy part concerns GDP. I think most people in the West have long assumed that if GDP rises fast enough and this thing out there we call an economy is healthy enough jobs will come rattling out so that people are okay, or at least people who are virtuous enough to want to work will be okay. There are Keynesians who think you have to goose it sometimes. There are Austrians who think that government can only mess it up. But the basic assumption is that if the economy is okay, some jobs will come out. I think we're seeing more and more evidence that that doesn't work in this, that paradigm is breaking down in this country. Certainly not the case in China right now. GDP goes up, you have lots of jobs. But meanwhile, we continue to believe that the point is GDP. A lot of, in kind of in academic levels, we speak as though GDP is the issue, when we look at the political landscape, employment's the issue. And they're not necessarily the same thing. So now we get into the irony part. Somehow we seem to have bought into the idea that the way we can increase employment right now is to increase the rate at which we extract non-human energy or tap into renewable sources of non-human energy and put it into machines that slave labor, which is to say reduce or eliminate labor inputs into production. And to me that is staggeringly, it's schizophrenic.
Yeah, so. A shortage of oil does not mean that you'll be unemployed. Okay? People had jobs in the US before we used a lot of oil. We had horses and things like that. So if you go back 200 years, people had jobs. What it does mean is if you go from a state of oil consumption to a lower state, or can't go to a higher state, then your options for the types of jobs and the productivity of those jobs are limited. Okay, in this country today, a newly employed person cannot use any more oil than was used the previous day. He must take that oil away from an incumbent in this country, okay? So if you want a new employee and you want to put him on an airplane to fly him somewhere, someone else had to give up that seat or you had to become more efficient. And that just makes it harder to re-employ people. It doesn't make it impossible because there are jobs you can do that don't require you to drive your car. Okay, you can reorganize your society, but it's a constraint. It's the Liebig's law of the minimum type thing that Gale writes about. And is that Liebig or Liebig? Liebig. But anyway, so it doesn't mean that people won't have jobs. It may mean that those jobs are lower productivity if we're not able to find a way to dematerialize that thing. And it will probably slow the rate of reabsorption of that labor.
Okay, we're getting close to being done here. So I have Carrie and Jeff. Anyone else have a burning question? This gentleman I know has, I don't think he's asking. So we're going to draw it there. Okay, so Carrie, Jeff, and this gentleman.
Thanks, Stephen, for answering my question before I asked it somehow. But so I was going to ask it sort of related to the law of the minimum, and the sort of percentage of GDP that you spend on energy could be extended to food. And as you said, think back 200 years or something, right? We were all roughly farmers, and you were producing your own food and that kind of thing. So in that sense, you can draw long-term trends since essentially the dawn of fossil fuels. So if you do this for the US, just looking at data, you will see that food plus energy consumption, if we count food as energy, it's basically hit a minimum a few years ago in the US, and it's obviously been declining for, we could say, roughly 200 years. So what's new about today with the oil problem? One is the climate, as Doug's mentioned, the climate is new, and this is also new, right? You can't have 0% of GDP on food and energy. So therefore there's a minimum somewhere, and perhaps we've hit that minimum. Is that a way to think about what the options are for the future? I mean, you're talking about it in different kinds of terms, but anybody out there?
I think we're past that minimum. I actually think it's risen, hasn't it? Yeah, probably. Yeah. But there's a level after which, below which for any commodity, you'll tend not to consume less of it. So if oil prices are low, then as your income increases, you'll tend to buy features for your car rather than reduce your oil consumption. Okay, because you don't need to lower it lower. If oil prices are high, you'll tend to reduce your oil consumption by taking fewer features. So it depends on where you are on the curve.
You know, automobiles, you look at what's happened to the automobile in North America. I mean, almost all of the efficiency improvements since 1980s went into horsepower per unit weight of the engine. Now, and then I made the point the other day that to drive a vehicle in the United States in 1999 was the cheapest inflation-adjusted price per mile driven in our history. You know, so it made a lot of sense to buy all those extra goodies on the cars and extra power this and power that. So.
Jeff Brown?
We've got a database of the top 33 net oil exporters, which I define as global net exports, and I think 3 of you gentlemen are probably familiar with some of our work. We looked at data from 2002 to 2011, and they looked at Chindia's net imports, and the ratio of global net exports to Chindia's net imports was 11 to 1 in 2002. It fell to 5.3 in 2011. Now, if you extrapolate the 05 to 11 rate of decline, in 18 years, that ratio would theoretically be 1.0, which means that China and India would be consuming 100% global net exports. I think we all agree it can't happen, but if you look at this 9 years of declines in 3-year segments, the rate of decline in the ratio is accelerating. So we're headed faster toward a point at which we cannot arrive. So I was wondering if you might address some scenarios.
Jeff, I'm going to have to give a little tutorial, or would you like to give it on net export? Because I think his response would be really good, but he's not familiar with the term. Yeah, so why don't you give us the Jeff Brown 2-second net export, because I think it fits, you know.
Like probably half the people in here, at least 2/3 probably heard this several times. Given a production decline in oil exporting country, unless consumption falls at the same rate of decline as production or at a faster rate, the rate of decline in net exports will exceed the production decline rate, and the net export decline rate will accelerate with time. A corollary to this is a bulk of post-peak cumulative net exports are shipped early in the decline phase. So if it takes 30 years to go zero net oil exports, a rough rule of thumb is in 10 years, half of post-peak cumulative net exports have already been shipped. And if we apply that to this, what I call available net exports, which is global less China and India, it fell from 40 million barrels a day in 05 to 35 in 2011. And if you extrapolate the data out, we have already consumed half of the post-2005 cumulative net oil exports that will be available to importers other than China and India.
One of the really key points there is 2005 was our peak global net exports. We've been in decline since. And so you take a country like Mexico, which has now stabilized its production declines, but yet their exports continue to fall because internal command. So apply that to Saudi Arabia. So any thoughts on that?
Actually, in the U.S., it's sort of going the other way. I guess our consumption levels are pretty constant, and we're actually producing more. So we're part of the offset from these reductions in net exports is, I guess, less in the way of net imports from the U.S. I guess at the same time, countries like Canada, I guess, their net exports are increasing. I don't know.
If you look at America's combined, North and South America, inclusive of rising net exports from Canada, fell from 6.1 in 2004 to 5.1 in 2011.
Jeff, you're just saying, in other words, right, what I said, that U.S. consumption will continue to decline at a pace, right? And that, so being squeezed out of export markets is energy independence, right? And it's going to, that's why it's going to decline at a pace, exactly what you're talking about. It's just the flip side of the same coin.
Hi, I guess I want to be like the random element that comes in and kind of get everybody to think outside the box a little bit, because the way my thinking has been developing is that, you know, the economic system of capitalism, and, you know, you take away oil, you take away jobs, and, you know, diametrically opposed to the environmental movement that says, hey, you've got to stop using oil. And so I really think that the conversations we need to start having have to do with how our economic system works, and really a rethinking of finance worldwide, in cooperation, of course, you know, with the rest of the world. Because the way that we keep going, and we kind of keep trying to put Band-Aids on things, and stay with this economic system we have, which basically says, you know, the book we have out there says the delusion of endless growth. You know, we have to find a way to live and reduce and go towards hyper-efficiency and not using so much fuel, and find ways to live locally and sustainably.
Well, that's what we're doing.
I think that's a great way. I really appreciate the question. There was a question. Great way to. We're going to draw the questions there. I don't know if there's any final comments from the panel. I really appreciate your panel. Let's give them a big round of applause.